I fell in love with a girl named Laura, but what I never knew was that she had a twin sister named Alice. For the longest time, I believed they were the same person. Sometimes she felt warm and gentle, other times distant and completely different, but I always ignored the strange feeling and convinced myself it was just her changing moods. Deep down, though, the vibe always felt slightly off in ways I could never explain. Only later did I realize I had actually been meeting two entirely different people without knowing it. And when I finally gathered the courage to confess my feelings properly, both of them suddenly disappeared without a trace. But when I finally discovered the truth, my heart broken beyond repair. Chapter 1. The first time he saw her. The rain outside had already gotten heavier by the time classes ended. Cold water continuously struck the classroom windows while students hurried through the hallways trying to escape before the weather became worse. The noisy atmosphere from earlier gradually faded little by little until only scattered conversations and distant footsteps remained across the building. Toby lazily packed his bag without much urgency because going home immediately never really mattered to him anyway. Beside him, David stretched dramatically before complaining that rainy days should automatically excuse students from all academic responsibilities. According to him, forcing people to attend lectures during weather like this counted as psychological warfare against exhausted college students. Toby barely reacted anymore because David complained about life almost every day. The two eventually stepped out into the corridor together while cold wind drifted softly through the open side windows. Rainwater occasionally splashed against the tiled floor near the railing while gray clouds covered the entire campus outside. David was still talking about instant noodles and emotional suffering when he suddenly grabbed Toby's sleeve midway through another complaint before lowering his voice dramatically and saying that he had just discovered a goddess standing inside the corridor. Toby immediately dismissed the statement as nonsense because David called almost every attractive girl on campus life-changing at least twice a week already. But David ignored him completely. Instead, he pointed somewhere farther ahead near the vending machines beside the corner windows while insisting that Toby look properly first before denying it. He even swore that the girl standing there was exactly Toby's type, which only made Toby frown slightly before asking when exactly David became an expert on his preferences in women. David confidently answered that years of friendship naturally made him qualified. With obvious reluctance, Toby finally lifted his gaze toward the direction David was pointing at. Then his thoughts paused for a brief moment. Near the vending machine, a girl stood quietly while tapping her phone against the payment screen again and again as if the machine had already rejected her several times. Long dark hair rested softly over her shoulders while cold wind occasionally brushed loose strands across her cheeks beneath the dim hallway lights. She was beautiful. Genuinely enough that Toby unconsciously slowed his steps afterward. Not in the loud kind of way that immediately attracted attention from an entire room. Something about her simply felt difficult to look away from. The soft cream-colored sweater beneath her coat, the calm expression on her face despite the rain, even the faint frustration in her eyes somehow looked strangely gentle. For some reason, the noisy hallway around her suddenly started feeling farther away. David noticed the change in his expression almost immediately because he suddenly grabbed Toby's shoulder before asking why he looked genuinely stunned all of a sudden. Toby instantly frowned and told him to stop exaggerating things, but David ignored the response completely and pointed toward the girl again while laughing under his breath as he asked why Toby suddenly stopped walking the moment he saw her. Toby opened his mouth slightly afterward before realizing he honestly didn't have an answer for that, and unfortunately David noticed the hesitation immediately. The grin on his face widened right away before he dramatically whispered that one look at the girl apparently made Toby forget how to function properly. Toby clicked his tongue softly before finally forcing himself to look away from the girl near the vending machine and asking why David always spoke like someone addicted to romance dramas. David answered without hesitation that he simply understood human emotions better than ordinary people, which immediately made Toby remind him that he literally failed psychology last semester. David dismissed that fact instantly by saying it was completely unrelated to the current situation. Then the machine rejected her payment again. The girl lowered her head slightly afterward before quietly exhaling through her nose in visible defeat. David immediately laughed under his breath before muttering that he personally would have declared war against the machine already. Toby shook his head slightly before continuing forward together with him. The moment they passed by the vending machine, the girl suddenly looked toward them before softly asking whether either of them happened to have coins. Her voice caught him slightly off guard, soft enough that it somehow blended naturally into the sound of rain surrounding the hallway. David immediately looked toward Toby with obvious amusement already appearing on his face while Toby ignored him and reached into his pocket for a few coins instead. The girl looked visibly relieved afterward before quietly thanking him and leaning down to insert the coins properly this time. David watched silently beside him for another moment before casually mentioning that most people usually surrendered after the third failed attempt. The girl looked toward him briefly before a faint smile appeared at the corner of her lips as she admitted that she almost did. David immediately declared that the vending machine had already won mentally, which finally made a quiet laugh escape her lips, small, warm enough that Toby somehow noticed that sound more clearly than everything else around him. A second later, the coffee can finally dropped inside the machine. After picking it up, the girl wrapped both hands around the warm can for a moment while steam still lingered faintly against the metal. Cold wind drifted softly through the corridor nearby while students continuously passed farther down the hallway beneath the sound of heavy rain outside. Then after glancing toward the rain-covered campus again, she quietly asked whether the weather always became this bad around evening. David answered immediately that with their luck, it would probably continue until graduation, which made her laugh again, this time slightly longer. Toby caught himself watching her without really meaning to, not only because she was pretty. There were plenty of attractive people on campus, but most conversations with strangers usually became awkward after the first few sentences. Talking to her somehow didn't. The silence between replies settled naturally instead of becoming uncomfortable, and for a brief moment he found himself wondering what kind of person she normally was outside this hallway. The thought itself caught him slightly off guard. After holding the warm coffee can for another moment, the girl eventually looked back toward Toby and quietly asked how much she owed him for the coins. The moment he casually answered that it was fine, her brows furrowed slightly as she asked whether he always gave money away this easily to strangers. Before Toby could answer properly, David suddenly clicked his tongue beside them and said that she should appreciate the moment because Toby normally treated money like part of his soul. That immediately made the girl laugh again while Toby frowned and asked why David always spoke like an unemployed uncle trying to embarrass people in public. David looked deeply offended by the accusation while the girl tried to hide another quiet laugh behind the coffee can in her hands. And strangely enough, watching her laugh made something inside Toby feel unexpectedly lighter. Not dramatic, just unfamiliar. Rain continued pouring heavily outside while students passed farther down the hallway in noisy groups before disappearing toward the stairs again. Yet somehow the small space near the vending machine felt strangely separated from the rest of the building. The girl eventually glanced outside once more while watching the heavy rain strike against the campus pathways. After another brief moment, she quietly wondered whether the weather planned to get even worse before everyone made it home because at this rate they would probably all end up completely soaked anyway. David immediately looked horrified by the possibility and declared that he emotionally lacked the strength to survive another cold shower disguised as weather. That instantly made the girl laugh softly again while Toby found himself watching the reaction without really meaning to. For some reason, the warmth in her laughter lingered strangely inside his chest afterward. David slowly looked between both of them before quietly muttering that he was starting to feel unnecessary there. Toby ignored him completely. The girl laughed softly again before finally glancing at the time on her phone. Then after quietly thanking Toby one last time for the coins, she slowly turned and walked farther down the corridor beneath the dim hallway lights. Toby's eyes unconsciously followed her figure for a few seconds longer than necessary, and strangely enough, even after she disappeared around the corner, the empty hallway still felt quieter than before she arrived. Meanwhile, David kept looking back and forth between Toby and the direction where the girl had just disappeared as if he genuinely couldn't believe what he had witnessed moments ago. After another second, he finally turned fully toward Toby before asking whether he even realized how hard he had been staring just now. Toby immediately frowned and told him to stop talking nonsense, but that only made David laugh under his breath while the two continued walking through the corridor together beneath the sound of heavy rain outside. After another few steps, David casually mentioned that he had genuinely never seen Toby look that interested in someone before. According to him, even professors explaining assignment deadlines usually failed to hold Toby's attention for longer than 10 seconds, yet somehow a random girl near a vending machine managed to make him stop walking entirely. Toby ignored him completely. Unfortunately, David continued talking anyway. He pointed out that the funniest part was that neither of them even asked for the girl's name. Yet Toby already looked like he was replaying the entire conversation inside his head. Only then did Toby realize it himself. Somehow the conversation had ended naturally without either side properly introducing themselves. For a brief moment, the image of the girl quietly holding the warm coffee can beneath the dim hallway lights surfaced inside his mind again. David noticed the slight change in his expression almost immediately afterward. A slow grin appeared on his face before he casually asked whether Toby already wanted to meet her again. Toby frowned slightly before asking where exactly David kept getting all this nonsense from. David simply shrugged. Then after another moment, he quietly said that people normally didn't remember small details that clearly unless the person already mattered at least a little to them. The words lingered strangely inside Toby's head afterward. By the time they reached the stairs near the main entrance, the sound of rain outside had already grown even heavier. Students continuously rushed past them toward buses and taxis while cold wind drifted through the open entrance nearby. David stretched lazily before reminding Toby not to accidentally fall in love overnight because he still needed assignment answers tomorrow morning. Then after casually waving one hand, he disappeared into the crowd outside beneath the rain. Toby remained near the entrance for another moment while his thoughts drifted back toward the girl near the vending machine almost immediately again. The loose strands of hair moving softly in the wind, the warmth hidden inside her quiet laughter, even the way she held the coffee can between both hands somehow stayed unusually clear inside his head. For some reason, the memory lingered far more vividly than it probably should have. Chapter 2. She felt different today. The weather the next morning felt almost unreal compared to yesterday. Warm sunlight poured across the college pathways while students filled the campus with their usual noise again. Conversations echoed endlessly through the corridors, footsteps hurried between classrooms, and soft morning wind drifted through the open buildings carrying the faint smell of coffee from somewhere downstairs. It honestly felt difficult to believe the entire campus had been drowning beneath cold rain only yesterday evening. Toby walked through the second-floor corridor while absent-mindedly scrolling through messages on his phone. Most of them were from David. One message accused him of staring at the mysterious vending machine girl like someone experiencing love at first sight, while another demanded assignment answers as compensation for emotional abandonment. Toby ignored every single one, yet his thoughts still occasionally drifted back toward yesterday anyway. The quiet hallway, the warm coffee can between her hands, and the soft laugh she tried to hide near the vending machine somehow remained unusually clear inside his head despite how short the interaction had actually been. As Toby turned the corner near the library corridor, someone suddenly brushed past his shoulder hard enough to nearly knock the phone from his hand. At the same time, a stack of books tilted dangerously sideways before the girl instinctively grabbed onto his wrist to steady herself. For one brief second, both of them froze awkwardly in the middle of the hallway while students continued squeezing past around them. Then the girl slowly looked up, and Toby's thoughts paused completely because it was the same eyes, the same long dark hair, and the same face he had spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about since yesterday evening. Yet somehow, the atmosphere around her felt completely different now. Her fingers still loosely held his wrist for another brief moment before she naturally let go again. Then after adjusting the books against her chest, she narrowed her eyes slightly before asking whether he always walked around campus while staring at his phone this seriously. The teasing tone in her voice caught him off guard immediately because yesterday near the vending machine, her voice carried a quiet softness that naturally blended into the sound of rain around them. Yet the girl standing in front of him now looked completely different. There was playful amusement hidden beneath every word she said, as if she genuinely enjoyed watching people become flustered around her. Toby unconsciously frowned slightly while trying to process the sudden difference, and the girl noticed immediately. After staring at him for another second, she casually asked whether they had met somewhere before or if he simply stared at strangers this intensely all the time. That instantly pulled Toby out of his thoughts. He quietly pointed out that she was the one who almost sent both of them falling into the hallway just now, which immediately made the girl narrow her eyes slightly before asking how the situation somehow became her fault when he was the one walking through campus while staring at his phone like the outside world didn't exist. She then added that she only grabbed his wrist because he apparently valued his phone more than basic human survival. That unexpectedly made Toby laugh quietly under his breath. The moment the sound escaped him, the teasing expression on the girl's face softened slightly. For the first time since the collision, she looked genuinely curious. Then after shifting the books against her chest again, she quietly admitted that she was already late for class because someone kept blocking the middle of the hallway dramatically. Toby immediately asked how the situation somehow became his fault now, but the girl only smiled softly before asking whether he always argued this seriously with people he barely knew. Toby answered that he was simply defending himself from false accusations. That immediately made her laugh again, and for some reason, talking to her felt strangely natural despite how unpredictable the conversation kept becoming. Toby found himself staring at her again before eventually realizing he still hadn't properly answered her earlier question. Honestly, he wasn't even sure how to explain this situation himself. Everything about her face felt familiar, yet somehow the person standing in front of him now carried completely different energy from the quiet girl near the vending machine yesterday evening. In the end, he simply answered that he thought they might have met before. The girl hummed softly afterward as if that answer entertained her more than it should have. Then after glancing briefly toward the phone still resting in his hand, she casually mentioned that at least now she knew who to blame if either of them eventually fell down the stairs someday. Toby shook his head slightly while asking whether she always talked like this to people she barely knew, and the girl immediately answered yes with absolutely no hesitation. That only made him laugh again. The girl noticed the reaction immediately afterward, and for the first time since bumping into him, the teasing expression on her face softened slightly. Then after another brief moment, she quietly admitted that she really was going to be late if she stayed there any longer. Toby nodded lightly. Then just before walking away, the girl suddenly turned back toward him again. A faint playful smile slowly appeared at the corner of her lips before she softly told him to stop staring at girls so intensely because it honestly wasn't very appropriate. Before Toby could even answer properly, she had already disappeared into the moving crowd of students nearby, leaving him standing alone in the hallway again while the noisy campus atmosphere slowly swallowed her from sight. Toby remained standing there for another few seconds longer than necessary while the conversation replayed inside his head almost automatically. Strangely enough, the warmth from her fingers still lingered faintly around his wrist, and before he even realized it himself, a quiet laugh escaped under his breath again. Unfortunately, that was the exact moment his phone suddenly started vibrating in his hand. David's name appeared across the screen. The moment Toby answered, David immediately sounded personally offended before asking whether he had secretly dropped out of college overnight because the lecture was about to start in less than 2 minutes. Toby glanced toward the crowded hallway again before quietly saying he was already coming. David instantly accused him of sounding suspiciously distracted before demanding to know whether the mysterious vending machine girl appeared again. Toby denied it a little too quickly. David noticed immediately. Then, with the excitement of someone discovering criminal evidence, he loudly announced through the phone that Toby was absolutely finished emotionally now. Several students walking nearby briefly turned toward him because of David's voice, which only made Toby hang up immediately before listening to the rest of the nonsense. By the time he entered the classroom a few minutes later, the lecture had already started. David sat near the back beside the windows while looking deeply disappointed the moment Toby finally dropped into the empty seat beside him. Without even lowering his voice properly, David immediately asked whether he had just witnessed destiny in the hallway again. Toby quietly told him to focus on class. David ignored that completely. Instead, he leaned slightly closer before pointing out that Toby somehow looked far more awake compared to earlier that morning. According to him, normal people usually didn't walk into lectures looking like they had just experienced emotional character development. Toby opened his notebook calmly while pretending not to hear him. Unfortunately, David continued talking anyway. He casually asked whether the mysterious girl at least had a name this time or if Toby planned to spend another entire day falling into emotional confusion over someone he technically still didn't know properly. Toby paused slightly. David noticed immediately. A slow grin spread across his face before he quietly muttered that the silence already told him everything he needed to know. Toby let out a quiet breath before reminding him that the lecture had already started 5 minutes ago. David glanced toward the professor briefly before whispering that education could wait because his friend was apparently living through the beginning of a romance story in real time. That almost made Toby laugh again. And unfortunately, David noticed that too. Chapter 3. Lunch with her. By lunchtime, the entire campus had become unbearably noisy. The cafeteria was packed with students, overlapping conversations echoed endlessly from every direction, and the smell of fried food mixed together with coffee hung heavily in the air. Finding an empty table during peak hours honestly required luck more than effort. Toby sat across from David near the far corner of the cafeteria while absent-mindedly stirring the ice inside his drink. At this point, he had probably rotated the same melting ice cube several times without realizing it, and unfortunately David noticed immediately. After watching him silently for almost a full minute, he finally narrowed his eyes before asking whether Toby planned to keep emotionally harassing that poor drink for the rest of lunch. Toby glanced up briefly before telling him to eat his food peacefully, but that only made David lean back in his chair with visible satisfaction as if he had just confirmed an important theory. According to him, ever since the mysterious vending machine girl appeared, Toby had started spacing out every few minutes like someone quietly losing a fight against his own thoughts. Toby immediately denied it, yet David looked completely unconvinced. Then after taking another bite of food, David casually asked whether Toby planned to actually find the girl properly or if he intended to keep acting confused every time she randomly appeared somewhere on campus instead. He pointed out that the college wasn't exactly small, so relying entirely on coincidence sounded unbelievably stupid. According to him, normal people would at least ask around a little after spending 2 separate conversations thinking about the same person this much. Toby immediately told him to stop making the situation sound weirder than it actually was. That only made David laugh quietly under his breath before asking why Toby suddenly looked defensive if none of it mattered. Toby paused slightly because only then did he realize he still technically didn't know her name. Yesterday's hallway conversation had somehow ended naturally before either of them properly introduced themselves again. David noticed the silence immediately afterward, and a slow grin appeared on his face before he quietly pointed out that Toby apparently managed to hold full conversations with beautiful girls while somehow skipping the most basic information possible. Toby let out a quiet breath while preparing himself to ignore the rest of David's nonsense, but then movement near the cafeteria entrance suddenly caught his attention unconsciously. Laura stood near the drink refrigerators while loosely holding a tray in one hand. Today her hair was tied back softly instead of resting over her shoulders like during the rainy evening near the vending machine, yet the calmer atmosphere around her somehow remained exactly the same. Even surrounded by noisy students, her presence naturally softened the space around her without effort. Before Toby realized it himself, his attention lingered on her for slightly too long, and David followed his gaze almost immediately afterward. Then, without even trying to hide it, David quietly laughed under his breath before asking whether he should respectfully leave and allow Destiny to continue working peacefully. Toby looked at him for another second before asking why David suddenly sounded more invested in finding the girl than he did himself. David immediately pointed out that somebody in the friendship had to move the story forward because Toby clearly planned to spend the next 6 months staring at people silently instead of asking basic questions like a normal human being. Toby can only sigh in his mind. A few moments later, Laura finally noticed him too. A small trace of surprise crossed her expression before she slowly walked toward their table, and for some reason, the closer she got, the quieter the surrounding cafeteria noise somehow started feeling inside Toby's head. Laura softly apologized for interrupting before asking whether the empty seat beside them was taken. Before Toby could answer properly, David immediately stood up dramatically before announcing that fate clearly wanted him gone anyway. Toby almost kicked him under the table for that, which only made Laura lower her head slightly as a quiet laugh escaped her lips. The sound carried the same softness from the rainy evening near the vending machine, completely different from the brighter teasing energy from the hallway collision yesterday morning. David grabbed his tray afterward before casually warning Toby not to forget him after eventually getting married someday. Then before Toby could throw something at him, he disappeared deeper into the cafeteria crowd while laughing to himself. For a brief moment afterward, silence settled naturally between the two of them. It wasn't awkward, just unfamiliar in a strangely comfortable way. Laura eventually placed a few coins gently onto the table near Toby's drink before quietly mentioning that she finally managed to return the money from the vending machine. Only then did Toby fully remember the rainy evening again. The hallway, the coffee can, and the soft sound of rain surrounding the conversation somehow resurfaced clearly inside his head all over again. He glanced toward the coins before quietly telling her that she honestly didn't need to return them. Laura shook her head lightly afterward before softly admitting that she didn't really like owing people things. Hearing that, Toby simply accepted it quietly instead of arguing further. After that, the conversation gradually slowed on its own while both of them continued eating together beneath the noisy cafeteria atmosphere surrounding them. Strangely enough, the silence never felt uncomfortable. Every now and then, Toby found himself unconsciously glancing toward Laura again while pretending to focus on his food immediately afterward. The loose strands of hair near her face occasionally moved softly whenever students passed nearby, and for some reason, simply sitting there across from her already felt strangely satisfying to him. More than once, he quietly told himself that he would only look one last time before focusing properly again. Unfortunately, it never actually stopped at one last glance. Meanwhile, Laura remained completely unaware while calmly eating across from him beneath the overlapping cafeteria noise around them. Eventually, after finishing the last few bites from her tray, Laura lightly wiped her hands with a tissue before glancing toward the time on her phone. Then after standing up slowly, she looked back toward Toby and softly mentioned that she should probably leave before her next lecture started. Toby nodded lightly. Laura gave a small smile afterward before quietly saying she would see him later. And unfortunately for him, even at that moment, Toby still failed to say anything properly back. He simply watched her walk away again like some complete fool already falling in love without realizing how obvious he had become. Chapter 4. One last time. Toby kept thinking about Laura's question long after lunch ended, whether the different version was bad. For some reason, the way she asked it lingered inside his head longer than the conversation itself. Not because the words sounded especially important, but because of the expression on her face afterward. Quiet, careful in a way that felt completely different from Alice, who somehow carried enough energy to turn a normal hallway conversation into chaos within seconds. By the time afternoon classes finally ended, the warm atmosphere outside had already begun cooling again. Soft sunset light spilled through the campus buildings while students slowly started leaving one by one beneath the fading orange sky. Beside him, David stretched dramatically before announcing that his academic motivation had officially died beyond recovery. Toby barely reacted. Unfortunately, David noticed immediately. A knowing grin slowly appeared on his face before he casually asked whether Toby planned to finally learn the girl's name sometime this century, or if he intended to continue surviving entirely on accidental encounters. Then after slinging his bag over one shoulder, David added that watching this unfold honestly felt painful because Toby somehow managed to talk to the same girl multiple times while still knowing almost nothing about her. Toby glanced at him briefly before asking why David sounded more frustrated about the situation than he was himself. David answered that it was because Toby had clearly stopped thinking logically. Whenever that girl appeared nearby, it was like his brain completely stopped working. Toby frowned slightly before asking why David kept speaking like he was personally involved in the situation. David immediately pointed out that somebody had to pay attention because Toby clearly wasn't doing it himself. Before the conversation could continue further, David's phone suddenly rang. A second later, his entire expression collapsed after apparently remembering some club meeting he had forgotten about completely. He cursed under his breath before hurriedly grabbing his bag. Then just before leaving, he pointed toward Toby seriously and warned him not to accidentally fall in love before finishing tomorrow's assignments. After that, he disappeared down the hallway almost immediately. The corridor gradually became quieter afterward. Toby remained near the classroom windows for another few minutes before finally deciding to head home. As Toby passed by the library corridor, his steps slowed slightly the moment he noticed Laura sitting alone near one of the large windows overlooking the campus courtyard. Several books remained spread loosely across the table in front of her while soft evening sunlight rested faintly across the space around her. Cold wind occasionally drifted through the slightly opened windows nearby, gently moving the loose strands of hair near her cheeks every few moments. One hand absent-mindedly remained against the open page she was reading while the other lightly held the warm coffee cup resting beside the scattered books. Every now and then, she would quietly underline something inside the pages before returning to reading again. Even surrounded by fading evening light, books, and the distant noise from outside campus, the peaceful atmosphere around her somehow made the rest of the world feel strangely far away. But the thought disappeared almost as quickly as it came. They weren't actually that close. Yes, they had spoken several times already. Yes, conversations somehow kept happening naturally between them lately. But sitting beside her uninvited while she was quietly studying suddenly felt too familiar somehow. Almost inappropriate in a way he couldn't properly explain even to himself. The realization alone made him quietly turn away before eventually choosing one of the farther corner seats instead. At least from there, he could still see her. Toby opened one of the books lying on the table afterward, pretending to read while the peaceful library atmosphere quietly settled around him. Soft page-turning sounds occasionally echoed from deeper inside the room while evening sunlight slowly dimmed across the windows. Yet despite the open pages sitting directly in front of him, his attention continuously drifted back toward Laura almost every few minutes without permission. Sometimes she quietly adjusted loose strands of hair behind her ear while reading. Sometimes she paused briefly while staring outside the windows as if lost in thought before returning to her notes again. And strangely enough, simply watching those small movements already felt enough for him. Time passed quietly like that for a while. Long enough for the sunlight outside to slowly fade darker across the library floor. Long enough for Toby to stop pretending he was actually reading anything at all. At one point, Laura lightly wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup beside her while lowering her gaze toward the pages in front of her again. The peaceful atmosphere around her somehow remained completely untouched by the noisy campus outside. And without realizing it properly, Toby found himself thinking that maybe this version of her suited evenings perfectly. Then suddenly, his phone vibrated against the table hard enough to pull him out of his thoughts. David's name appeared across the screen. The moment Toby answered quietly, David immediately complained from the other side of the call that the club meeting had already ended nearly 20 minutes ago and he was still waiting alone near the campus entrance like some abandoned side character. Then with growing suspicion in his voice, he asked whether Toby had secretly disappeared somewhere to look for the girl. Toby glanced toward Laura instinctively afterward before quietly telling him he was coming soon. David immediately asked where exactly he was. Then after another second, he casually added that if Toby was actually busy with something, he could just come over there instead. The moment those words reached his ears, Toby nearly felt his soul leave his body. If David walked into the library right now and caught him sitting alone in the corner secretly staring at Laura for nearly half an hour, his life would genuinely be over. Forget surviving the rest of college peacefully. David would absolutely bring this up until the day both of them died. Toby immediately told him not to come before David could even finish speaking properly. Then after lowering his voice slightly, he quickly added that he was already leaving and would reach the entrance in 5 minutes, so David just needed to wait quietly like a normal person for once. After quietly gathering his things together, Toby slowly stood from the seat near the far corner of the library while trying not to make unnecessary noise in the already peaceful atmosphere around him. The chair shifted softly against the floor beneath the fading evening silence before he adjusted the strap of his bag over one shoulder and started walking toward the exit. Yet even while leaving, one thought quietly lingered inside his head. He wanted to look at her one last time before going. The realization itself felt slightly ridiculous to him. It wasn't like they were dating. They weren't even properly close yet. Still, Just before reaching the library door, Toby found himself slowing down almost unconsciously before eventually turning back toward Laura again. She remained seated near the large windows exactly the same as before, quietly reading beneath the dim orange evening light while occasionally turning another page with calm, unhurried movements. Soft evening wind drifted through the slightly opened windows nearby, causing loose strands of hair near her face to move gently every few moments. One of her hands lightly held the warm coffee cup resting beside the scattered books while the other absent-mindedly remained against the open page in front of her. Nothing especially important was happening. Yet somehow, the small scene still felt strangely difficult to walk away from. For a brief moment, Toby quietly wondered whether he had already started liking her far more than he originally intended. Then eventually, after lingering there slightly longer than necessary, he finally turned toward the library door and started leaving. At almost the exact same moment, Laura slowly lifted her eyes from the book resting in front of her. Her gaze naturally drifted toward the exit, toward him, but by then, Toby had already turned away and disappeared beyond the library doors without ever noticing that Laura had looked up at him before leaving. While walking down the campus stairs afterward, Toby suddenly realized he had spent all that time staring at her, yet somehow it never once felt like wasted time to him. Chapter 5. He decided to confess. The moment Toby stepped outside the library building, cold evening wind immediately brushed against his face while distant noises from the campus pathways echoed beneath the darkening sky. Students continuously passed around him in scattered groups, laughing, complaining about assignments, talking about dinner plans, yet none of it properly reached his thoughts. His mind still remained inside the library. Laura quietly sitting near the windows beneath the fading sunset light, the peaceful atmosphere surrounding her, the way he kept wanting to look at her again even while leaving. Everything about the evening lingered strangely inside his chest. David stood waiting near the stairs exactly where he promised, lazily scrolling through his phone with the exhausted expression of someone emotionally damaged by club activities. The moment he noticed Toby approaching, he shoved the phone back into his pocket before dramatically complaining that normal people usually didn't disappear for this long without warning. Toby lightly kicked the side of David's shoe while walking past him afterward. Not hard, just enough to make David stop mid-sentence immediately. That only made David look even more confused before asking why Toby suddenly kicked him for no reason. Toby muttered under his breath that David became annoying whenever he talked too much. David looked genuinely offended afterward before loudly asking how talking became a crime now. That only made Toby walk slightly faster toward the campus gate while telling him to shut up already. Unfortunately, David kept following beside him anyway while continuing to complain dramatically about being abused by his own friends after surviving exhausting club activities. Normally, Toby would have responded properly. Tonight, he barely listened. His thoughts continuously drifted back toward the library again instead. Laura quietly lowering her gaze while reading, the soft evening light resting across her face, the calm silence between them that somehow never felt awkward. Even now, remembering it still made something inside his chest feel strangely restless. By the time Toby finally separated from David near the bus stop and reached home later that evening, the quiet atmosphere from the library still refused to leave his head properly. After taking a shower and changing clothes, he eventually ended up lying on his bed beneath the darkness of his room while cold night air drifted softly through the slightly opened window nearby. His phone rested abandoned beside him while faint city noises occasionally echoed from somewhere outside. Yet despite the silence surrounding him now, his thoughts somehow felt louder than usual. Again and again, his mind replayed small moments from the past few days without permission. The rainy evening near the vending machine, Laura quietly laughing while holding the warm coffee can between both hands. The cafeteria conversations. The library. The final moment before leaving when he wanted to turn back toward her one last time. Toby slowly covered part of his face with one hand afterward while letting out a long quiet breath into the darkness. Only now did the realization finally settle properly inside him. He liked her. Not simple attraction. Not temporary curiosity. Somewhere along the way, Laura had naturally become part of his thoughts without him even realizing when it started happening. And honestly, that realization alone terrified him slightly because no matter how much he tried distracting himself afterward, his mind still kept returning to her again naturally. The way she spoke, the way her presence somehow made noisy places feel quieter. Even sitting silently near her already felt enough somehow. Toby stared toward the ceiling quietly for another long moment afterward before eventually laughing softly at himself beneath his breath. At this point, denying it would honestly just become pathetic. If these feelings already felt this real now, continuing to hide them silently would only make things worse later. Sooner or later, he would have to tell her. The thought alone made his chest feel strangely tight afterward. Confessing meant risking everything becoming awkward later. Risking rejection. Risking losing even the small connection they already had now. Yet strangely enough, Even after thinking about all of that carefully, the answer inside him still didn't change. He still wanted to tell her no matter what happened afterward. Toby slowly closed his eyes afterward while the quiet night air continued drifting softly through the room. Then finally, somewhere beneath the restless noise inside his thoughts, he made the decision clearly to himself. He would confess to Laura. Chapter 6. The day he couldn't find her. Toby woke up earlier than usual the next morning. For several seconds after opening his eyes, he simply stared quietly toward the ceiling while yesterday night's decision slowly returned to his thoughts again. He would confess to Laura. Even now, fully remembering the decision still made something inside his chest feel restless. Yet strangely enough, the nervousness didn't make him want to run away from it anymore. If anything, after finally admitting his feelings to himself properly, everything inside him somehow felt clearer compared to before. After getting ready, Toby stood in front of the mirror slightly longer than normal while adjusting the collar of his shirt again. The realization alone almost made him feel ridiculous afterward because he normally didn't care this much about appearance before going to campus. Yet today somehow felt different. While walking toward the university later that morning, his thoughts continuously drifted toward possible conversations inside his head without permission. Not dramatic confessions. Not movie-like speeches. Honestly, he still had absolutely no idea how he planned to say any of it properly. He only knew one thing. If the chance appeared while they were alone somewhere, he wanted to tell her honestly. The thought alone already made his heartbeat feel strangely unstable. By the time he finally reached campus, warm morning sunlight still covered most of the pathways while students continuously filled the corridors with their usual noise. Conversations echoed everywhere while distant laughter drifted between classrooms together with the smell of coffee from the cafeteria downstairs. Normally, Toby would have walked through campus without paying much attention to anything around him. Today was different. Almost unconsciously, his eyes kept searching for Laura everywhere he went. Near the vending machines, the library corridor, the cafeteria entrance, even crowded stairways where Alice might suddenly appear behind him again just to grab his sleeve and complain about something completely unnecessary. Yet neither of them appeared anywhere the entire day. No quiet Laura sitting beside the windows with books spread across the table. No teasing Alice casually forcing cold canned drinks into his hands while pretending it meant nothing. No soft warmth. No restless energy. Nothing. And strangely enough, the absence itself slowly became impossible for Toby to ignore little by little throughout the day. Of course, inside his head, both Laura and Alice still naturally belonged to the same person anyway. That was exactly why his feelings had already become this confusing without him fully realizing it yet. At first, Toby didn't think much about it. College campuses were large. Missing someone for a few hours honestly meant nothing. Still, by lunchtime, a strange disappointment had already started quietly settling inside his chest. David eventually noticed something was wrong while the two sat near the cafeteria windows later that afternoon. More specifically, David noticed Toby repeatedly glancing toward the cafeteria entrance every few minutes like someone waiting for a delayed emotional disaster to arrive. After watching him silently for another moment, David eventually asked whether Toby had secretly developed separation anxiety overnight. Toby immediately told him to shut up. Unfortunately, David only looked more suspicious afterward. Then after another few seconds, he casually asked whether Toby was looking for someone. The question instantly made Toby pause slightly. Only for a second. But unfortunately, David noticed even that. A slow grin immediately appeared across his face afterward while he leaned back dramatically against the chair before quietly announcing that everything suddenly made sense now. Toby asked what exactly was supposed to make sense. David ignored the question completely before casually asking whether the mysterious girl failed to appear today and emotionally destroyed campus life for him in the process. Toby genuinely considered throwing his drink at him. Instead, he simply muttered that David seriously needed hobbies outside of annoying people. David proudly answered that annoying Toby already counted as a full-time career. Normally, the conversation would have irritated him more. Today, Toby barely reacted because even while sitting there listening to David's nonsense, part of his attention still remained fixed on the cafeteria entrance unconsciously. Yet neither Laura nor Alice appeared. By the time afternoon classes finally ended, gray clouds had already started slowly covering the sky outside little by little. The warm sunlight from earlier disappeared beneath heavier weather while humid wind drifted through the open corridors around campus. Still nothing. At one point while walking past the library building again, Toby even slowed slightly near the same windows where he saw Laura yesterday evening. The seat remained empty. For some reason, that bothered him more than it should have. Only then did Toby finally realize something slightly embarrassing himself. He had spent almost the entire day unconsciously waiting to see her again. The realization alone made him let out a long quiet breath afterward while lightly rubbing the back of his neck beneath the cooling evening air. Maybe she was simply absent today. Maybe she got busy somewhere else. Maybe he had just been unlucky. Whatever the reason was, continuously searching around campus like this would not magically make her appear. Eventually, Toby quietly admitted defeat to himself. He would confess another day instead. The thought felt strangely disappointing after everything he spent the entire night deciding yesterday, yet at the same time, part of him also felt relieved. Honestly, even this morning he still had no proper idea how he planned to confess without sounding completely insane halfway through it. Still, if either version of her appeared tomorrow, he would do it. That much he quietly decided again inside his head while walking through the evening corridors. By evening, the weather finally collapsed completely. Heavy rain suddenly started pouring across the campus without warning while cold wind rushed violently through the pathways outside. Students immediately crowded beneath building entrances while distant thunder echoed across the darkening sky. Toby stood near one of the covered walkways watching rainwater continuously strike the pavement outside while restless thoughts quietly lingered inside his chest again. For some reason, the campus somehow felt unusually empty today without seeing her even once. Chapter 7. Their Death. The rain from yesterday continued through most of the night. Even by morning, gray clouds still covered the sky while cold wind drifted through the university pathways beneath the damp atmosphere left behind by the storm. Students moved through campus more quietly than usual while puddles of rainwater reflected the dull morning light across the sidewalks. Toby stepped through the main university gate while lightly adjusting the strap of his bag over one shoulder. Despite barely sleeping properly last night, one thought still remained fixed inside his head from the moment he woke up. If he saw her today, he would confess. No more delaying it. No more quietly waiting for the perfect moment that probably didn't even exist. At this point, his feelings had already grown too large to continue pretending they meant nothing. While walking through campus afterward, his eyes unconsciously searched through the surroundings again without permission. Near the vending machines, the cafeteria entrance, the library corridor, even crowded stairways where Alice usually appeared suddenly out of nowhere before dragging him into pointless conversations. Yet every place still felt strangely empty. Still, unlike yesterday, Toby tried convincing himself not to overthink it too much. Maybe she simply arrived late. Maybe she was somewhere else on campus already. So instead of sitting in one place, he spent most of the morning wandering slowly through different parts of the university while absent-minded thoughts about her continuously drifted through his head. Laura quietly reading near the library windows. Alice laughing loudly in crowded hallways. The peaceful warmth around one, the restless energy around the other. And somehow, inside his mind, both still naturally blended together into the same person he had fallen for without even realizing it properly. At one point while passing through the central courtyard, Toby suddenly noticed an unusual crowd gathered near one side of the campus building. Several students stood together whispering quietly while others continuously checked their phones with visibly shocked expressions. The atmosphere immediately felt wrong somehow. As Toby slowly walked closer, fragments of conversations gradually reached his ears through the noise around him. Serious accident yesterday night, during the rain, both sisters. The moment those words reached him, something inside his chest tightened slightly without reason. A strange feeling. Cold, uncomfortable. One of the students nearby eventually noticed Toby standing there confused before quietly asking whether he hadn't heard the news yet. Toby frowned slightly before asking what happened. For a brief second, the other student hesitated. Then quietly explained that two girls from the university had died in a car accident the previous night while returning back into the city during the heavy rainstorm. According to what people were saying, another vehicle lost control on the wet road before crashing directly into them. The student lowered his voice slightly afterward before pulling out his phone. "There's already photos everywhere in the university group chats," he quietly muttered. Then he turned the screen toward Toby. On the phone screen, two girls stood smiling beside each other in what looked like an older family photo. Laura Bennett, Alice Bennett. Same face, same eyes, yet standing beside each other now, the difference between them suddenly became painfully obvious. Laura's calmer smile, Alice's brighter, more playful expression. For one long second, Toby genuinely stopped understanding what he was looking at. The noise around campus suddenly felt distant, muted, like his thoughts themselves had frozen completely. The other student continued speaking quietly afterward, mentioning something about how Laura Bennett and Alice Bennett were apparently twins and had gone outside the city yesterday because of a family-related matter before trying to return during the storm. Twins. The word echoed heavily inside Toby's head afterward. Only then did everything suddenly begin connecting together all at once inside his mind. The different personalities. The completely different atmospheres. The moments that never fully made sense. Laura and Alice were never two sides of the same person. They were two completely different people. And somehow, he never realized it until hearing about their deaths. Toby stood there silently while the conversations around him continued blending together into meaningless noise. His thoughts desperately replayed every memory from the past few days again and again, as if trying to reject reality itself somehow. Laura quietly smiling near the library windows. Alice grabbing his sleeve through crowded hallways. The rainy evening near the vending machine. The cafeteria conversations. The cold canned drink forced into his hands. Every small moment suddenly separated clearly into two different people inside his memories now. And both of them were gone. Just like that. Without warning. Without giving him even one more chance to see them again. Something inside his chest collapsed quietly afterward. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just unbearably heavy. Toby slowly lowered his gaze toward the wet pavement beneath his feet while cold wind drifted through the courtyard around him. Around the campus, conversations continued normally little by little as students slowly returned toward classes again. But for him, the entire world suddenly felt strangely distant. Yesterday morning, he spent hours searching across campus hoping to see her again. Today, he finally learned why she never appeared. Because she never would again. Toby slowly turned away from the crowd afterward and started walking without knowing where exactly he was going anymore. His steps felt strangely unsteady while the heavy pressure inside his chest continued tightening little by little with every passing second. Then suddenly, rain started falling again. At first only a few drops struck the pavement around him. Then within moments, the sky completely broke apart above the campus. Heavy rain poured violently across the pathways while cold wind rushed through the university grounds again. Students immediately started running toward nearby buildings for shelter while umbrellas opened everywhere around him. But Toby kept walking forward anyway. His eyes had already started turning red long before the rain fully reached him. At some point while walking beneath the storm, tears quietly started falling from his eyes too. Yet beneath the heavy rain pouring endlessly across his face, nobody around him could properly tell the difference anymore. For a long time, Toby simply kept walking through the rain alone while memories of Laura Bennett and Alice Bennett continuously replayed inside his head one after another. Laura's quiet warmth, Alice's restless energy, the small moments, the unfinished conversations, the confession he would never get to say anymore. Sometimes fate changed direction too suddenly for people to understand. One day someone quietly entered your life without warning. And another day, they disappeared from the world just as suddenly. Toby once believed he still had time. Time to confess. Time to understand them properly. Time to see them again. But in the end, all those unfinished feelings remained trapped silently inside him forever. Because now Laura and Alice no longer existed anywhere in his future. Only inside his memories.